Week 2 is going to be concerning implementing basic control structures and functions. Now, there's going to be a lot of ground that we have to cover here. And so to begin the week, the first thing you're going to do is there's two chapters in Python for Data Analysis, chapters 2 and 3. And that covers the basic parts of the Python language. So this is the fundamental building block upon which all the rest of these next weeks are going to be rely on. So I would ask that you again spend time, do that reading first, and then jump in and start trying to go through the assignment piece of it. So first of all, I'm going to show you a demonstration script, and then I'm going to show you kind of the student assignment piece of it. And this is the way with the cadence that we're going to use for the rest of the course. Each week, I'm going to have a demonstration, and I'm going to show you how the basic pieces work. And then you're going to be challenged with an assignment, and the assignment is going to have some specific questions, different questions than what you have for the demonstration, to where you're going to have to respond back into it. So that's where the two notebooks come into play. And obviously, if there's any questions, please reach out on the forums or directly in email to your instructor. So this one right here, the objective is to apply the knowledge of basic control structures and functions in Python. And for this demonstration, I'm going to show you 4 things that kind of touch on most of the pieces here. And I'll explain kind of control structures and some of the things within the functions that we're going to use as part of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 4 things. First of all, I'm going to write a function that takes a list of integers and returns the sum of all the even numbers in that list. I'm going to write a function that takes a list of strings and returns a new list containing only the strings that have a length greater than 5. I'm going to write a function that takes in a string and checks whether or not it's a palindrome. So in other words, it reads the same forward and backward, such as Taco Cat. And then finally, I'm going to make up a Python program that asks the user to enter a number and then prints all the numbers from 1 to that number, along with whether or not that number is even or odd. And so by doing this, it's going to hit on all 5 of the basic learning objectives for the course. Now, what I'm going to ask you to turn back as your assignment is a Python file containing the functions of the programs. In this case, I'm going to show you the example of 4. You're going to have a different number for your assignment. And then the text file containing sample inputs and outputs for each program. So this is going to be the one which I'm going to show you for yours, but let's go through this first. Grading criteria for this is correct and functional of functionality for each function and parts of the program, the proper use of basic control structures and functions, code readability and organization, and you're encouraged to work collaboratively, but you must submit your own work. And you're going to hear me again repeat this again and again each week. You should utilize version control to manage your code and collaborate with peers. But again, it has to be your work, not somebody else's. So let's take this first assignment here. The first question here. Let's write a Python function that takes a list of integers and returns the sum of all the even numbers in that list. So this is where I would build out a function. And so here's all the individual pieces. Now, as discussed in the reading, this is the keyword in order to say that you're going to create a function. So in this code block here, I'm going to put def, which is defined for function. And then I'm going to call my function sum even numbers with underscores underneath it. This type of a naming convention is quite common and quite ubiquitous across all Python users. But although when you actually get into the field, when you actually get to using this in a real world example, they may have different naming standards. I'm using something that's a generally accepted practice, so that's why I'm going to kind of show this in the examples. This is the way that most people would use whenever they're defining a function. Now, numbers in this case here, this is a parameter. And so in this case here, numbers isn't explicitly defined as a data type. Proper, you could use either. I'm just going to use it as an any type here. Again, just to keep it simple for you as you're learning the language. But you could also have named types as part of this. Now, I'm going to take in a parameter called numbers, and I'm going to return from my function sum even, which is going to be another variable that I use just internally inside of my function. Now you'll also notice kind of the indentions here. This is very important. Python is picky about having the indentions just so. So as you're writing a Python program, you'll want to make sure that you indent the way that you see here. So this is the correct format for building out a function. Now, first thing I'm going to do in my function is I'm going to create a variable that I'm just going to use internally into my function. So the scope of sum even, which again is any type of variable in this case, but that the scope of sum even is going to be only within this function. If I have another function outside of it, it won't use sum even because sum even basically dies, it goes away whenever this end of the function happens, this return happens. So that's another piece to understand is kind of the scope of a variable will only live within the context from which it is. If sum even was outside of that function, then sum even would be known as a global, and it would be something that could be used across multiple. But now global variables come at a price. It does take up additional resources, i.e. memory, in order for you to have those global variables. It's also maybe not the best practice to have a bunch of globals, especially as you get larger and larger programs. You're going to see that it has, more and more. If you have more and more globals, it's going to span across multiple projects. And then when you're trying to debug, you're going to have difficulty kind of nailing down exactly where that variable came from, if it's a global scope as opposed to a local scope, as you see here. One of the biggest control structures you'll see is the for loop. And so here again, I'm using one of the very common ones, a for loop, to just iterate through a list of numbers. So if I say the numbers which I'm going to have is going to be 1 to 10, if I say in 1 to 10, then numbers as it comes in, that's going to be this array of 10. It's going to start for num, so it's going to start at 1. So at 1, 2 numbers, in this case 10. So that's how you would read this for loop right here. It's going to loop through this little structure right here 10 times. Now, if I had another 10 variables here, then this would loop through 20 times, obviously. So the next control structure we're going to talk about, which again was covered in the text, is the if construct. So if, and we're going to use this number %2 and then double equal sign. So if this number, this function right here equals 0, then it falls inside of this if statement right here. So if you've used other types of languages such as R, such as C, very commonly it requires you to have a then or else type of keynote on it. For Python, you don't need that. So if we're using this for loop right here, it's going to loop through number of times. So in this case, 10. And then it's going to use this operator right here. Now, those of you who have been through the R course may see this and understand this one. This is the modulus operator. So what it's going to do is whatever the number is, it's going to divide that by 2. And if that's a 0, then that means it's a whole number. So if I'm dividing something by 2, you know it's an even number. So what it's going to do is it's going to count right here, and it's going to say, okay, modulus 2, if that equals 0, then I'm going to take sum even, which I set to 0 to start off, initialize. I'm going to do a plus equals that num. So it's going to continue to add, continue to add, continue to add as it continues to increment up. And then the final thing it's going to do is it's going to return. As it returns, it's going to return the value that we just calculated. So coming in, it's going to have a string of 10 numbers. It's going to set this little counter variable to 0, and then it's going to spin through 10 times, because there's 10 numbers in our little string here. It's going to mod each one of those and divide them by 2. And so if it's an even number, then you know it's an even number. Then if it is an even number, it's going to increment by 1. And so that's what this statement says right here. So then if we do, if we make a call to it, so I'm going to stage this as an example test for it. So here I'm going to have numbers, and I'm going to create this array here of 1 to 10. I'm then going to turn around and use the print statement. So using the print function, calling my function I just created, calling numbers inside of it. So as you can see, the power of the language, you can nest a whole bunch of functions together and just have it all within one call. Here's how you run this inside of Visual Studio Code. So if I execute this right here, I get the little green check. It gives me a 30. So I know that my function's working. And so that's the structure of a basic function that's also using counter variables. It's using parameters. It's using a for loop. It's also using the modulus and equals and incrementer keywords. The next question which we're going to have, write a Python function that takes a list of strings and returns a new list containing only the strings that have a length greater than 5. So here we're going to use a couple more things. We've got the function as we described above. I'm going to initialize an empty array here, calling it long strings. And then so for every string in strings, so for every element inside of strings, I'm going to check the length, and if the length is greater than 5, then I'm going to use the append keyword as part of it. So again, this is something that was in the reading. It's using a built-in function of strings that uses the append, and I'm just going to continue to append on the back end of it. Using my test statement right here, strings equals this array, I'm going to print using my function I just defined, and using strings, and the output should be dragon fruit and eggplant. So let's go ahead and run it. I set this to a longer string. So this one here is set to 5. This one's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one's over 5. This one's over 5. This one's over 5. Now, if I set this number to 10, for example, and let me rerun this, only dragon fruit shows up, because it's checking the length of that string and it's going against what the total amount is. Next, we're going to create the is palindrome. So very similar. It's going to use the function parameter, and just about as simple as it can possibly get, this is going to take the string, it's going to reverse the string. So by doing this ::-1, it basically takes the string and it reverses the string. So if I have an example string of race car and I have an example string of hello, for instance, if I take race car and I look at this, RACECAR, okay, so RRAACC, yep, that's a palindrome. But if I look at hello, HELLOHO, that's not a palindrome. So again, if I run this example, it comes back as true, it comes back as false, because it's returning whether or not that comparison is equal. And so if it is a palindrome, it'll return back yes, otherwise it'll return back false. And then finally, this one here is going to ask the user for an input number. So using the input keyword, I'm going to put a prompt out there saying enter this number. Now, as you can see, we talked a little bit earlier about using this as a named variable. So by doing the int here, it's going to force it to be an integer coming back out of it. So that's an important thing. So instead of using the any like we did up here, and then Python will automatically determine what that is based off of the parameters that you feed to it, this one here I'm going to actually just set it up and force it to be, coerce it to be an integer. Here we're doing another for next loop, and we're going to do a for 1 to n plus 1. So whatever the length of that number is, it's going to go to that. If it's modulus 2, it's even. If otherwise, it's an odd. And so here we saw the if statement. Here's an if-else construct. So if you wanted to do an if-else, this is how you could do an if-else. And as you will see again, you see that the indentation really makes a big difference. It means something here. And so then if we run this, this is the output that we get. 1 is odd, 2 is even, 3 is odd, 4 is even. So that gives you just a basic demonstration of some of the main control structures that are used inside of Python, as well as some of the basic functionality of the language. Now, this is again scratching the surface, but for your assignment is going to be relatively straightforward too as well. Let me go to the student assignment here. So you'll have this provided to you. What you should do is you should come into this assignment and you should replace this name right here. You should put your name in here. And then you should answer these 7 questions. So the first one is, write a Python function to find the maximum of 2 numbers. The next question is for the minimum of 2 numbers. Then you're going to check to see if a number is even or odd. So again, think about what we did in the demonstration script as far as the modulus operator. Print a program to print all even numbers from 1 to 100. So now you're going to build off of that. You're going to start with the modulus operator, and then you're going to turn around and run it inside of a for loop, and you're going to print off those that meet that criteria. And then it's the opposite. Print all the odd numbers from 1 to 100. Question 6, find the sum of all numbers from 1 to 100. And then finally, finding a factorial of a given number. So your deliverable is to take this notebook here, which is provided to you in the material. You'll modify it to include the Python code as well as any documentation related to your submission. I would ask that you add the documentation directly to the notebook itself, so you just have to submit the one file to us. You'll be graded on the completeness and correctness of the implementation. So step number 1, you should run this script to make sure that it is good. Proper use of basic control structures, the if then, else, the for next loop, the function constructs. Code efficiency. So we'll be looking to see how efficient your code is. There are other ways that you could do this without using an if or without using a for next loop. So for example, you could do a whole series of if to do the checks for the odds and the evens. That's not the most efficient way to write it. It's actually very inefficient to write it that way. So if you do something like that, depending on how bad it is, you'll either get a point reduction or you'll get kind of some constructive feedback on how you could make that better. Now, I will give you a heads up that these first couple weeks, as you're learning the language, going to have a little bit of leeway as far as the code efficiency piece of it. That's going to come into play later in the course as you really start to put together more larger projects and more larger notebooks. That's where those are going to come into play. Clarity and readability of the code. So as you can see, this has got a lot of documentation that's going along with it. It's very clean. It's very easy to read. If you just have a set of statements that actually execute correctly, if it isn't readable, then you're going to get ding points because of the clarity and the readability item. Again, if in doubt, reach out, ask, and I will give you the instructor will give you some additional clarification on that particular piece. And then finally, compliance with the instructions and deliverables, making sure you double check to make sure all of these deliverables have been completed as kind of outlined here. And so then to begin your submission, you can see that this has got the markdown. It's also got the code pieces. So you just come down to this first particular piece and you would begin writing your first function right here. So for example, each of these have a code block and each of these have a markdown. So you should just have to click after this. You just click into the next one. You click into the next one. When you're done with this, then you take this file here and you upload it to Blackboard. Now in addition, you should go into your GitHub or your GitLab or your Git instance, and you should upload it to Git as well so that you have a copy of it up in Git. The other thing which I'll tell you is if you have it in Git like this and you want to make a change to it, this is one of the nice things about GitHub. So let's say here is my student submission right here. And let's say I want to insert my name, I want to add it. If I just push the period key, it automatically sets me up with a web editor right there. And so from within this, I can go and I can start making my code changes directly into this. Again, remembering to put my name right here. Okay, students, so that's basically the second week of the course. That's the assignment. From this, you're gonna have to turn this back in to Blackboard, and then it'll be graded against the grading rubric. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out on the forums or directly to your instructor in email. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.